You got the glimpse of the fact that we're building our lives upon a rock. And there's the theme in 1 Peter that just kind of runs through 1 Peter in particular about Jesus being the cornerstone, about him being the rock that we build our lives on. And it's a great theme in that book. And we're going to continue with that today. Back in the 19th century, H.G. Wells wrote a book. That book was called The Invisible Man. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to read that book or not. I don't think it's as great a book as the movies that have come from it. You ever seen the movies about the invisible man? Have you ever thought about what it would be like to be invisible? I mean, haven't we all thought at some point in time it would be really nice to kind of be a fly on the wall and hear what people really think about us? What they're saying, maybe to attend and sit in the back at our own funeral and hear what people really are talking about, what they say about us. On the other hand, that might be very depressing, okay? But the idea of this was this guy came up with some scientific method by which he rendered himself invisible. And that sounds okay. I mean, certainly it sounds like a great idea, but, nearly all things that have an upside also have a downside. And the downside was that any physical thing that he came into contact with wasn't invisible. So, for example, if he ate food, you could see the food until it was assimilated into his body, and so he wasn't truly invisible. If he put on clothes, they weren't. This was kind of a reverse of that old short story about the emperor's new clothes. Remember that one? Where the emperor runs around naked thinking he's fully dressed. This guy thinks he's invisible. He's really not. And it raises a question in my mind. How do you deal with a relationship with someone who is invisible? And that's the way that Peter starts off 1 Peter 1, verses 8 and 9. You love him even though you have never seen him. Though you do not see him now, you trust him and you rejoice with a glorious, inexpressible joy. The reward for trusting him will be the salvation of your souls. That is the New Living Translation of 1 Peter 1, verses 8 and 9. Notice what Peter says to the people reading it. This is the first century readers. He says, you've never seen him. He's talking about Jesus. We saw that back last week as we looked at verse 7. You've never seen him. You don't see him now. And yet, you love him. And yet, you trust him. Love and trust is a way we describe relationship. And Peter says we have this relationship with the invisible God. How do you have a relationship with someone you've never seen? Someone you don't see? I mean, every once in a while we hear people talk about, absence makes the heart grow fonder. And I guess there's some truth to that. When you're around somebody and then all of a sudden you're not around them anymore, there's this sense that, the absence kind of makes you remember the better things and the absence makes the heart grow fonder. But this is not talking about someone that you've seen for a while and then they're gone. He says you've never seen him. How do you have a relationship with someone you've never seen? How do you love someone you've never seen? How do you trust someone you've never seen? We want to see God. I mean, going all the way back to Moses at Sinai, the thing Moses wanted more than anything else was to see God. You've got that text in Exodus 33, verse 18 beginning. Moses said, now show me your glory. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. The Lord, anytime you see the word Lord in all caps like this, that is a place where in Hebrew, the unutterable name of God is given. Yahweh. We don't even know for sure how to pronounce it. These days, most people think it was Yahweh. 100 years ago, they said Jehovah. And the reason is because the Hebrews took seriously that commandment that said, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And so whenever they came across that name in Scripture, what they would do instead is they would read the word Adonai, which means Lord. But anytime in your Old Testaments you see Lord in all caps, that's a place where the name of God appears, Yahweh. Then Yahweh said, there is a place near me where you may stand on a rock, and when my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand. until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. That sounds like that would make a good song, don't you think? Something like, He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock, and shadows me there with His hand. Somebody ought to write a song like that sometime. Moses wanted to see the God whom he had never seen. He'd seen manifestations of God, burning bush, miracles in Egypt, plagues. He saw evidence of God, but he said, I want to see you. We want to see God. No doubt about that. But we kind of feel like Isaiah. Isaiah 45 verse 15 says, truly you are a God who hides Himself. Peter says, you've never seen Him, yet you love Him. You don't see Him now, yet you trust Him. We don't have a lot in common with God. But Peter says we do have this relationship, and that relationship is based on love and trust. And those two things are inseparable. You love Him even though you've never seen Him. Though you do not see Him now, you trust Him. Now, who are these folks Peter was writing to? I mean, obviously, long range, he's writing to you and me, and it's true that you and I haven't seen Jesus. But even the people Peter's writing to, they had never seen Jesus. I mean, there were 12 disciples that went with Jesus a lot of places for a period of about 3 years. And these fellows had spent some time with Him, and they knew Him. But Peter was one of those. But the fellows he's writing to, the folks he's writing to, are folks who had never had that experience. They are the converts of those who had seen Jesus. Now, people tend to be a kind of a skeptical lot. If somebody were to walk in here today and say, had breakfast with Jesus this morning, we'd probably not take them too seriously. We'd probably move away a little bit, don't you think? We're a little skeptical, okay? These folks were converts of the ones who had spent time with Jesus. There was something about the message of Peter and James and John and Andrew and the rest of the apostles that made them take seriously the claim that they'd been with Jesus. The folks he's writing this to are folks that Jesus had prayed for. In the longest prayer that Jesus uttered, sometimes we call that prayer in Matthew the Lord's Prayer. That's not really the Lord's Prayer. That's a model prayer that He gives for disciples to show us how we ought to pray. If you want to see the real Lord's Prayer, it's this high priestly prayer in John chapter 17, where He starts off by talking about glorifying God Himself and God strengthening those that are with Him. And then He turns to those that are yet to come, you and me. I do not ask for these only, these right around me, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. Jesus to the 12 to us. How do Christians know that these guys didn't just make this up? How do you love someone you've never seen? To tell you the truth, it happens these days. I mean, somebody who met and developed a relationship and connected and fell in love before they ever laid eyes on each other. You know somebody like that. Can't imagine who it might be. The guy was here in Indio. The woman was in Portland. There was a series of odd circumstances that brought them together. They connected over the internet before they ever laid eyes on each other. And here we are, years later. Looks like it's going to work. We do know this sort of thing does happen. I think one thing we miss in our world today is an understanding of what constitutes love. To our world, love is a feeling. It's an emotion. That is not what love is in the New Testament. In the New Testament, love is a decision. I like that video that Bob shared this morning from Randy Harris, where he says the real question is not, can you live the Sermon on the Mount? The real question is, will you? It's not a question of ability, it's a question of will. There are 4 words in the New Testament for love. I've shared this with you before. 3 of the words have something to do with something about you that makes you attractive to me. Eros has to do with the fact that you make me feel good. You know, philia has to do with the fact that we enjoy doing the same things. Storge has to do with the fact that there's blood that connects us. I mean, we're family, that kind of thing. But the word Jesus used, the word the New Testament uses for love, is one that the early writers just pretty much abandoned in secular Greek. And that was that word agape. And that word has to do with a decision. It has nothing to do with anything inherent in the object of love to make them lovable. Most of you know my assignment these days is in family law, which means I deal with a lot of dysfunctional people. And if people understood that love is a decision, it's not an emotion, I probably would go out of business. Because what happens almost invariably is you've got these 2 people, and one of them says, what am I getting out of this relationship? And the answer is never enough. And so they decide, chuck the relationship. I'm done. Ask yourself this question. What is God getting out of the relationship he has with you? Zilch. Nothing. What do you bring to your relationship with God? Nothing. He loves you anyway. It's a decision. It's a choice. It's a conscious decision on his part that has nothing to do with anything lovable about you or me. The only thing we can offer him is our adoration. And our adoration results in the way we live. We obey, we follow him, we drink in his words, and we make them a part of our lives. But it's not because we're inherently lovable. Paul says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. It's about his blood that should have flowed from me. We sang that in the song this morning. You love him even though you've never seen him. Though you do not see him now, you trust him. Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? And he said, you can sum up the whole Old Testament. You can sum up all of the 600 some odd commandments on top of the 10. You can sum up all of those with one simple formula. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Now, if you do that, you don't have to worry about idolatry. You don't have to worry about taking the Lord's name in vain. You don't have to worry about dealing with, using his day for other stuff. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If you do that, you don't have to worry about the rest of the commands. But number 1, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. All that you and I have to offer God is our adoration. And our adoration results in our conduct. So that Jesus would say this, John 14, verse 15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. The opposite of that is if you don't keep my commandments, you don't love me. See, they go together. It's 2 sides of the same coin. We see this sign occasionally. Think about this. When you pick up the phone and you dial 911, you call an emergency in, you don't see the operator on the other end of the line. Do you believe they're there? You believe they're going to send help? You sure do. You don't see them. But you trust them, right? You believe they're going to do something to help you out. And God comes along and he says essentially the same thing. As a matter of fact, he says this, Jeremiah 33 verse 3. Call to me and I will answer you. He makes himself available to us even though we've never seen him. And so Peter says, you love him even though you've never seen him. And though you do not see him now, you trust him. Love is about trust. Do you remember when Paul wrote that great chapter on love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13? He describes this multifaceted rainbow of love, all the things that love is and love does. Love is patient, it's kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it's not self-seeking, not easily angered, keeps no record of wrongs, does not delight in evil, rejoices with the truth. But notice these last ones. Always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. It hangs in there. It always believes the best about the person, the individual it loves. That word trust, it's interesting here. I'm glad that the New Living Translation translates it this way in 1 Peter 1, verse 8. Though you do not see him now, you trust him. Most of our translations say you believe him, or you go back here to all of these lists of things. Most of our translations of 1 Corinthians 13, instead of saying always trusts, say always believes. But what we need to understand is the Greek word for belief has to do with more than just cognitive ability. It's not more than just I accept the proposition that 2 + 2 = 4. I've got a friend back in Texas. I mentioned him in the dedication to my book. I mentioned him. His name is Jack Miller. He's fond of asking me all kinds of questions. Questions that there are all kinds of possible answers. He says, what do you get when you get 1 + 1? Well, you think you get 2. Well, that depends. That assumes you're in base 10. It assumes you're not talking binary. Okay? What you get depends on a lot of assumptions that we have. Well, the Greek word pisteuo, I like the way Thayer described it in his lexicon when he talked about the way it's used in the Gospels. He said it is a conviction full of joyful trust that Jesus is the Messiah, co-joined with obedience. Conviction, trust, obedience. He puts those three together. If you don't have obedience, you don't have trust. If you don't have trust, you don't have the faith that's described in the Gospels. I don't know if I've ever told you the story or not about the fellow who strung a tightrope across a gorge, and he walked back and forth across it, and the crowd was gathering. And then he asked the people in the crowd, he says, do you believe I can do this and push a wheelbarrow? Yeah. Do you believe I can do this and push a wheelbarrow with somebody inside the wheelbarrow? Oh, yeah, we believe you can do that. Fine, climb in. Have you ever been to a circus and you've seen the performers? I remember when I was growing up, you see this occasionally on some of these television shows like, Ed Sullivan. How many of you remember Ed Sullivan? Okay, good. Okay. Anyway, you see these guys get up there and they'd have their beautiful assistant, always the beautiful assistant doing this. Notice she's always the one that's on the spinning wheel. He's always the one throwing the knives. Have you ever noticed that? Never the other way around. So she's on the spinning wheel and he's flinging knives at her and those knives always miss her, right? Now, we all know as the audience that he's going to miss her. Right? We know that, don't we? We know he can do this. But if he asks you to get up and take her spot, there's the difference between cognitive belief and trust right there. Always trusts. Well, that's what he says here. You trust him. You don't see him, but you trust him. John says we don't know what we're going to be like at the end. We do know we're going to be like him. Because he says, we shall see him as he is. Don't see him now. Haven't ever seen him. But we will see him. Job, what kept him going with all of the problems he had, all the physical ailments he had? What kept him going was things like this. Job 19, verses 25 to 27. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. And Paul comes along and says, you know, this life we live as Christians, we live it by faith, not by sight. Some of you are familiar with the fact that one of my favorite songs is that song written by Horatio Spafford, It Is Well With My Soul. I've told you the story about this song. Think about this. I mean, here's a fellow. He was born in the 1820s in Troy, New York. He moved to Chicago where he became a lawyer. He was a successful lawyer. He married Anne, his wife, in 1861. Anything else of note happened in 1861? How about the beginning of the U.S. Civil War? Okay? They were close friends of a number of missionaries, Dwight Moody, Philip P. Bliss. And before the Civil War, Horatio and Anne were involved in a lot of what you might think of as social and Christian motivated activities. They were involved in, for example, trying to abolish slavery. And she was involved in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And they were close friends with Dwight Moody and Philip P. Bliss, who spent time in their home. And that's their home right there. Had a successful law practice, situated in downtown Chicago. In 1871, he bought a whole lot of property in Chicago, spring of that year. Chicago was growing by leaps and bounds, and he couldn't possibly go wrong. You know, real estate's always a good investment, but in October, Chicago got burnt to the ground, and his real estate empire went up in smoke. He and Anne had a child. The child died as an infant. They had another child. That child died as an infant. 1873, they're just now beginning to recover from this disastrous Chicago fire. And they decide they're going to take a long-term vacation. They're going to go over to Europe where they're going to get involved in one of Dwight Moody's campaigns. This is during the revival period in Europe. And they're going to go over and get involved in Dwight Moody's campaign. Well, some business situations arose that kept Horatio from catching the boat with his family. So his family, his wife and 4 daughters at that time, got on the steamer Vieux de Havre, and they set out across the Atlantic. Along about the time that people are celebrating Thanksgiving, on November 22nd, 1873, the Vieux de Havre was struck broadside by a British sailing ship, the Lochern. It went down in 12 minutes. Anna and her 4 children were on deck. The last thing she remembers was her infant being swept out of her arms after she'd already lost the other 3. There are the kids that they had up to that point, the ones on the top. Annie, Maggie, Bessie, and Tanetta all drowned. Anna survived, but she was unconscious. There was a plank that floated up under her and buoyed her until she regained her consciousness. She was collected aboard the ship that had actually hit theirs, the Tri-Mountain, and she and 57 survivors made it the rest of the way to Europe. When she got to Europe, she telegraphed back to Horatio, who had no idea that this had happened. And her telegraph starts out this way: saved alone. What shall I do? Well, naturally, he catches the next ship across the Atlantic. And on his way across, the captain, when they got to the point where the Vieux de Havre had gone down, goes and gets him from his stateroom, tells him, this is about where your family lost their lives. He goes back to his stateroom, and he sits down and composes the words to a song that we sing, It Is Well With My Soul. See, it was written by him in 1873. This is just a matter of weeks after he's lost his family. It was put to music by his friend, Philip P. Bliss, and if you'll notice, Bliss named the song, the tune, after the ship that Spafford lost his family on. We know the song, but do you notice the last verse of that song? And Lord, haste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. Could you love a God you had never seen? Could you trust